This post was partially inspired by a recent vlog by Kyle Hill about the recent Nobel Prize in Physics. Before I get too far into this, I need to make one thing clear. I really think that Jesus really died on the cross and then later was raised in the same physical, human body. There is one reason that I believe this. The theological theories which continue to progress, birth new theories, and find application in the daily lives of those who live them tend to draw out of the well that begins with Jesus really dying on the cross and then later raising in the same physical, human body. This ties well into the explanation of a good theory put forward by Columbia University Emeritus Professor of Philosophy Philip Kitcher when he said that the three characteristics of a good theory are that it has a wide application, leads to new areas of study, and it can be tested. The theory that Christ really died and then was really raised led Paul to see this as a path to forgiveness, and the church theorists that have followed in that thought have expanded into Roman Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, Reformed, Lutheran, and mainline understandings based on this concept. These theories are used to explain how people with very different backgrounds and goals can work together to understand God and build a better society. Each of these come at the problem from slightly different angles, similar to how string theory and loop quantum gravity come at the problem of unifying relativity and quantum mechanics from slightly different angles. What about testing the theory of the resurrection, though? Well, no, not strictly speaking. It's a matter of history. It either happened, or it didn't. It's used to explain other things which do get daily application, but itself it is a matter of history. How reliable is the historical record on that point, though? To get straight to the point, even if we accept the record as it stands, what can we really say about what happened 2,000 years ago? To get away from religion, let's look at something that isn't quite so heated. The slave rebellion led by Spartacus, known as the Third Civil War. We only have a few records of the event that survived to the present day. Of these, the backstory given to Spartacus is completely different in two of them. There's a reason it gets the name Third, also. In the 300 or so years surrounding the event, the Roman Empire only experienced 3 wars with rebellious slaves that lasted more than a few months. The 3 numbered Servile Wars each lasted around 3 years. The Third Servile War didn't leave any known imprint on the archaeological record. All that remains are textual records. Other than their records connected to the Third Servile War, many of the people connected to Spartacus have no other place in history. None of these things keep the Third Servile War from being accepted generally as recorded, a 3-year resistance of slaves trying to escape the control of their masters and the Roman Empire led by a man using the name Spartacus. But there's a lot we don't know about the Third Servile War as well. The details about who Spartacus was before he started the campaign are unclear. It's not entirely clear where a bunch of slaves got military-grade weapons. It's completely unclear what happened to Spartacus's body during the Battle of the Salarius River. There is an upper limit to the granularity that the historical records available can provide. There is a proposed explanation for the resurrection called the Swooned theory. According to this theory, Christ didn't really die. Some versions of the theory depend on some kind of conspiracy, but not all of them. To use just the simplest form of this theory, Jesus suffered from Lazarus syndrome. In some sense, Jesus had to have suffered from Lazarus syndrome if he was resurrected. Lazarus syndrome is just a description that a person appeared by all external measures to be dead, and then later was alive. The question of what it means to be really dead is totally bypassed in the diagnosis of Lazarus syndrome. A heart that has been stopped for 5 minutes most likely isn't going to start again. Yet there are documented cases of Lazarus syndrome, also called medical resurrection, that have taken multiple hours to wake up. As far as our best understanding goes, several of these well-documented instances should not have been able to recover. Yet they did. They should have been really dead. 2 questions immediately jump to my mind. The first is, were they really dead? I suppose there's always going to be that old standby. It depends what you mean by really dead. One might employ a meaning for really dead that requires that the person not show metabolic activity ever again. If that's the definition one is fixed on, then Jesus was never really dead either. What's more, by that definition, no one could ever be reasonably sure that a given person was really dead until a time equal to the longest case of Lazarus syndrome had passed. In any instance, it could be a case of Lazarus syndrome. So while I do find merit for this definition of really dead in some contexts, I think it's clear that the definition becomes an exercise in begging the question when applied here. Since Lazarus syndrome is by definition those cases where there is no external indication of metabolic function and yet the person does eventually wake up, and the definition of really dead at play is that the person never again shows evidence of metabolic function, then when you're under that definition, anyone with Lazarus syndrome, or anyone who has ever been respected, wasn't really dead. But I mean something else when I'm asking the question. What I mean is a little fuzzier in a way, and a little more concrete in another. I mean that the person is without metabolic function, and that's definitely more concrete. We run into a similar definition paradox, though, since the definition of Lazarus syndrome is that there's no sign of metabolic activity, then it means that they really do appear dead. Any appeal to, "Oh, there must be some unseen metabolic activity," is based on conjecture, not observation. It's faith, not science. If it were observed, then by definition it wouldn't be Lazarus syndrome. The second question that comes to my mind is, what are the significance of these medical resurrections? We attach a great deal of significance to Jesus' resurrection in Christian theology. Should we attach the same level of significance to every resurrection? I think that there is definitely one way in which modern medical resurrections do become significant. I'll call it the believability angle. There is a claim out there that history cannot report on events that couldn't have happened. That's begging the question, and I dealt with it a little last week. But there's more. How rare does something have to be before history is forbidden from talking about it? There are 38 cases of Lazarus syndrome that were very well documented between 1982 and 1993. In the course of several centuries, there were only 3 slave rebellions that lasted more than a few months. That's why they were numbered. The First Civil War, the Second Civil War, and the Third Civil War. We don't number civil wars, because there are enough of them that it's easy to skip one accidentally in our counting between the first century and now. If we were to discover that there was actually another civil war between the first and second that had gone unnumbered, we would name it and make a note in our history books. Like we do with Jewish rebellions against Rome. There's the First Jewish-Roman War, then at one point it was common to call the Bar Kokhba Revolt the Second Jewish-Roman War. But between them there was the Kitos War, and it didn't get counted for various reasons. So instead of renumbering, in some textbooks you'll find an asterisk or a note later in the chapter or whatever the editors decide is best if the author insists on using the older term for the Bar Kokhba Revolt. We don't number resurrections for the same reason we don't number civil wars. There are too many of them. If we're going to claim that reporting a resurrection is out of bounds for a historian because they're so rare, then a slave rebellion is even more rare and should therefore also be out of bounds. The criteria that keeps those people from accepting the resurrection as a historical fact, if applied consistently, would keep them from accepting the rebellion of Spartacus as a historical fact. Then there's another angle where these modern resurrections are not generally as important as the resurrection of Jesus. I'll call it the experimental angle. Jesus wasn't just any old Lazarus. Jesus did something that very few people do. He made theological claims and attached them to the truth of his own upcoming resurrection. Now, to be clear, this isn't all that I think the resurrection is. There's a lot to the theological implications of the resurrection. That said, it is those other things and it is also this. When Bell was figuring out how elementary particles would act if they were non-local, there was a prediction involved. There were some who wanted to just accept quantum orthodoxy without testing it. But this year's Nobel Prize winners disagreed. They wanted to put the question to the test, and by doing so they learned what is real, and those who were committed to the idea that particle physics is local are demonstrated to be counter to the evidence. Jesus was willing to put his theological theories to the test in the same way. He claimed to be the Son of God, and as the Son of God, if he were killed by those in power acting in an attempt to silence him, he would be back in 3 days. And so he was there on Passover, allowing the people in authority to arrest him, push him through a corrupt trial, and then kill him. However, his closest friends and followers kept teaching his teaching. They claimed to have seen Jesus alive after the execution in small groups. In direct connection to the teaching that Jesus was still alive, they refused to accumulate personal wealth, took care of the poor and abandoned, and in a few cases even refused to recant even until they were executed by their enemies. They or their immediate followers recorded their teaching in the 4 Gospels and a collection of letters. Might Jesus have swooned, based on the information we have? Might he have been only dead in whatever sense modern examples of Lazarus syndrome are dead? Maybe. Jesus' followers wouldn't have had a clearer understanding of that than we do now. The injuries are fatal, but that's not unique to this particular example of Lazarus syndrome. They would not have had all the terminology we have to describe the situation. They may have seen the same thing that we observe in modern cases of Lazarus syndrome. When you come down to it, that doesn't matter. Jesus still had predictions related to his execution which, within the scope of our granularity, did come true. In the same way that those who hold to physics being local despite the work of Bell, Aspect, Clauser, and Zeilinger hold to that despite the overwhelming evidence to the contrary, those that hold that Jesus was not the Son of God do so despite the records of resurrection. Just like you're welcome to hold to the belief that particle physics must be local because that's the only thing that makes sense to you, you're welcome to deny the resurrection because that's the only thing that makes sense to you. Many times the thing that just makes sense is also the thing that's counter to the evidence, though.